Hearst Castle, San Simeon, 1947. The wind off the Pacific has finally quieted, and the hilltop is almost still. Beneath the twin bell towers of Casa Grande, the great terrace is empty. The last guests have gone. The project is already more memory than worksite. 3 decades earlier, in 1919, William Randolph Hearst had stood on this same ridge above the ranch road at 750 Hearst Castle Road and asked Julia Morgan for something a little more comfortable up on the hill, a retreat on La Cuesta Encantada overlooking San Simeon Bay. Now, marble balustrades, imported ceilings, and a Roman temple, transplanted stone by stone from Europe, frame the turquoise stillness of the Neptune pool, rebuilt 3 times at his whim. A single carved marble figure gazes over the water, emblem of both mastery and excess. Below, accountants in New York are cataloging tapestries in silver to pay the debts that fed this view. The story begins not with William, but with George Hearst riding the coastal ranch above San Simeon in the 1860s. The elder Hearst, a mining magnate who had struck fortune in Nevada's Comstock lode and later in South Dakota's Homestake mine, understood land as both resource and legacy. In 1865, he purchased some 40,000 acres at Piedra Blanca along the central California coast, drawn by the rolling hills that tumbled toward the Pacific and the potential for cattle ranching on a grand scale. Over the next decades, he expanded the holding to more than 250,000 acres, turning the windswept grasslands above San Simeon Bay into a cattle empire that stretched from the Santa Lucia Mountains to the sea. On a favorite rise, the family called Camp Hill, young William climbed behind pack mules and ponies to reach a simple campsite overlooking the bay. Decades later, he would describe the journey with remembered exertion. He had to come up hanging on to the tail of a pony. The camp was primitive, canvas tents, outdoor cooking, water hauled from springs, but the view was extraordinary. From the ridgeline, the Pacific stretched west to the horizon, unbroken except by occasional kelp beds and the dark shapes of sea lions hauling onto rocks below. To the east, the Santa Lucia Range rose in tawny folds, dotted with oak and madrone. It was a landscape of scale and solitude, qualities that would later define the architecture built upon it. George Hearst died in 1891, leaving the ranch to his widow, Phoebe Apperson Hearst. She was a formidable figure in her own right, a philanthropist, University of California regent, and patron of the arts who had traveled extensively in Europe and Egypt, filling her homes with antiquities and architectural fragments. Her son William, born in 1863, inherited not only his father's business acumen, but his mother's collecting instincts. By the time Phoebe died in 1919, William Randolph Hearst was 56 years old and one of the most powerful media figures in America. His newspaper chain stretched from New York to San Francisco. His magazines influenced fashion and politics. His newsreels shaped how millions saw the world. He was also, by most accounts, exhausted by the pace of urban life and by the complications of his marriage to Millicent Wilson, with whom he had 5 sons. The inheritance of Camp Hill and its vast ranch came at a moment when Hearst was ready to imagine something new. The location was remote, days of travel by rail from New York, then a train to San Luis Obispo, then a rough road to the coast, and finally the climb to the ridgeline. That remoteness was part of its allure. Hearst intended it as both escape and stage, a place where he could retreat from public scrutiny, but also host the Hollywood stars and political figures who orbited his influence. In the spring of 1919, he wrote to California architect Julia Morgan, asking for something a little more comfortable up on the hill. Morgan was an unusual choice in many respects, though not for the Hearst family. Born in 1872 in San Francisco, she had graduated from the University of California, Berkeley, in civil engineering, before becoming the first woman admitted to the architecture program at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, where she studied from 1898 to 1902. Returning to California, she had opened her own practice in San Francisco in 1904 and had already designed several buildings for Phoebe Apperson Hearst, including structures at Mills College and the rebuilding of the Fairmont Hotel after the 1906 earthquake. She was known for her meticulous attention to structural engineering, her ability to work with reinforced concrete, and her willingness to adapt historical styles to California conditions. She was also discreet, tireless, and comfortable working with demanding clients. Morgan's early site drawings from late 1919 show no castle at all, just a cluster of Mediterranean-style cottages and terraces oriented toward the sea, a modest extension of the existing ranch culture. But the topography was demanding. The hilltop, at roughly 1,600 feet above sea level, was exposed to wind, fog, and occasional winter storms. The soil was unstable in places, requiring deep foundations. Morgan studied the geology carefully, consulting with engineers about drainage and seismic considerations. Her solution was to propose a massive concrete platform cut into the apex of the hill, an artificial acropolis that would later support Casa Grande and the pools. This platform, poured in stages over the early 1920s, became the literal foundation for everything that followed. In these first drawings and in letters between San Simeon and San Francisco, architectural ambition was still a set of pencil lines. A gravity-fed water system from springs in the Santa Lucia Range, a private hydroelectric plant to power lights and elevators, and a wharf at San Simeon Bay to receive materials by ship. The supply chain of excess was not yet excess, it was just infrastructure. But the cause and effect logic was already there. Once you could bring anything to the hill, you could imagine building everything on it. Morgan's office in the Merchants Exchange building in San Francisco became the nerve center of the project. She hired draftsmen, structural engineers, and specialists in mechanical systems. She corresponded with art dealers in New York and Europe, translating Hearst's increasingly ambitious requests for antique ceilings, carved doors, and tapestries into architectural specifications. She kept meticulous records, every drawing numbered, every change order documented, every shipment tracked. Over the course of the project, her office would produce thousands of drawings, from site plans to full-scale details of moldings and tile patterns. At the end of 1919, the hillside at dusk was empty. No Casa Grande yet, only survey stakes and a rough platform where the Neptune pool would one day sit. On a drawing board in Morgan's San Francisco office, a tiny sketch figure stood at the edge of an unbuilt terrace. The future marble statue had not yet arrived, but its outline existed in the architect's imagination, the first hint that beauty here would be bought in pieces from far away. The estate was still a campsite, but the financial machinery that would one day nearly break its owner had already been set in motion by a single request for comfort on a hill. By the spring of 1920, Julia Morgan began making the punishing 8-hour train trip from San Francisco to San Luis Obispo every few weeks, then driving the remaining miles to the coast and up the rough road to Camp Hill. She would maintain this routine for nearly 3 decades. Modern historians estimate she made this trip at least 558 times, a logistical cadence that mirrored the relentless pace of construction. Her letters to Hearst, preserved in archives at California Polytechnic State University and elsewhere, reveal both the practical challenges and the creative collaboration that define the project. Her first built work at San Simeon was not Casa Grande, but 3 guest houses, Casa del Mar, Casa del Monte, Casa del Sol, begun around 1920 and 1921. Their names gestured toward the landscape: House of the Sea, House of the Mountain, House of the Sun. Each was designed in a Mediterranean revival style, with reinforced concrete frames clad in white stucco and topped with red Spanish tile roofs. The concrete was essential. It provided structural integrity against earthquakes and wind, and it allowed Morgan to create forms that mimicked historical masonry while incorporating modern plumbing, electrical systems, and steel reinforcement. The guest houses were small by later standards. Each had perhaps 10 to 15 rooms, but they were already furnished with imported carved ceilings, stone fireplaces, and antique doors sourced through New York and European dealers. The construction process was itself a feat of logistics. Materials arrived by ship at San Simeon Bay, 6 miles from the hilltop. Morgan designed a wharf reinforcement and extension in the early 1920s, adding steel tracks and wheeled platforms that ran along the pier to warehouses where art and building materials were unloaded from coastal steamers. From there, a narrow-gauge railway climbed the 6 miles to the construction site, snaking through oak-studded hills and crossing ravines on timber trestles. Every stone block, every crate of Murano glass or carved wood rode this man-made artery inland. Photographs from the period show flatbed cars loaded with terracotta roof tiles, stacks of lumber, rolls of pipe, and wooden crates stenciled with shipping labels from Genoa, Barcelona, and New York. Meanwhile, Morgan engineered the invisible systems required for Hearst's vision. A series of reservoirs was built in the early 1920s, fed by gravity from mountain springs in the Santa Lucia Range and piped to the hilltop to supply both drinking water and hydroelectric power. The water flowed through miles of pipe, some of it buried, some exposed along the hillsides. The hydroelectric plant, a small but sophisticated installation, provided enough electricity to run lights, elevators, refrigeration, and eventually the heating system for the outdoor pools. These systems were essential. Without them, the hilltop could not support the number of people and the level of comfort Hearst envisioned. But they were also expensive, requiring constant maintenance and periodic upgrades as the estate grew. In April 1922, work began on the main house Casa Grande. Morgan's design drew heavily on Spanish colonial and Baroque sources, particularly the Cathedral of Santa Maria la Mayor in Ronda, Spain, whose twin bell towers inspired Casa Grande's iconic facade. The structural frame was again steel-reinforced concrete, a modern skeleton dressed in historical stone and stucco. The plan was unusual, a T-shape that wrapped itself around 2 existing oak trees that Hearst refused to fell. This decision, sentimental perhaps, but also revealing of his attachment to the landscape, led Morgan to develop techniques for moving mature trees. Later, when other oaks interfered with construction, she would tunnel under their root systems, encasing the roots in concrete and moving the entire tree on rollers to a new location. It was a literal engineering of landscape to accommodate architecture, a reversal of the usual logic where buildings adapt to existing topography. Casa Grande's construction proceeded in stages. The foundation was poured first, a massive concrete mat anchored into bedrock. Then came the structural frame, rising in bays and columns through 1922 and 1923. The building was designed to be flexible. Interior walls were often non-structural partitions that could be moved as Hearst changed his mind about room layouts. The concrete frame allowed for large openings and soaring ceilings, essential for accommodating the imported historical ceilings that Hearst was already acquiring. By late 1923, the shell was largely complete, its twin bell towers rising more than 130 feet above the terrace, visible for miles from the coastal highway and the ranch roads below. Near the southern edge of the platform, Morgan marked out an ornamental pond that would soon become the first version of the Neptune pool. It was still modest in 1922 and 1923, edged with temporary concrete and rough balustrades, more a reflecting pool than a swimming facility. But in early 1924, at Millicent Hearst's urging during a visit to the site, that pond was enlarged into a proper swimming pool, the first of 3 major rebuildings that would eventually give it its Roman temple facade and marble sculptures. Workers poured a new, deeper basin and installed tile and plumbing for circulation and heating. Even in its first iteration, the pool was striking. A turquoise rectangle perched on the edge of the hill, framed by the mountains to the east and the ocean to the west. At the end of a long day, workers sometimes paused at the edge of the unfinished pool, watching the wind braid ripples across the water. The light at sunset turned the stucco walls of Casa Grande gold, and the distant sound of the Pacific surf carried faintly up the hill. For the laborers, carpenters, masons, plumbers, electricians, the project was steady work in an era when construction jobs were often seasonal. For Morgan, it was an experiment in how far architecture could be pushed when cost was not the primary constraint. For Hearst, it was the beginning of something he could not yet fully articulate, a place that would be both retreat and monument, private and performative, an escape from the world and a stage for displaying his mastery of it. By 1924, Casa Grande's rising shell dominated the hilltop. Scaffolding clung to the bell towers. Workmen hauled buckets of mortar and tile up wooden ramps. An archival photograph from 1923 shows the main structure silhouetted against fog rolling in from the coast, the small ornamental pond barely visible in the foreground. On its edge stood a temporary concrete plinth where a marble figure would one day pose. The hill was still a worksite, but the outline of excess was emerging in reinforced concrete and imported stone. As the first pool filled with mountain water, Hearst's art dealers in New York began wiring descriptions of entire European ceilings for sale, and the enchanted hill started to demand a constant tide of ships. In the early 1920s, the United States was flush with post-war wealth. Industrial fortunes in publishing, steel, oil, and finance sought cultural legitimacy through architecture, philanthropy, and European art. The Beaux-Arts tradition, filtered through architects like Stanford White and Richard Morris Hunt, had already introduced the practice of transplanting whole rooms from European palaces and manor houses into American mansions. Hearst and Morgan were working within this milieu, but on a scale that would far exceed most contemporaries. Where other collectors might purchase a single carved fireplace or a painted ceiling, Hearst envisioned entire interiors assembled from fragments of earlier civilizations. The context matters because it transformed San Simeon from an eccentric ranch house into a competitive gesture. Hearst was not merely building for comfort, he was building to rival the Vanderbilt estates in Newport, the Huntington residence in Pasadena, the Frick mansion in New York. He was making a statement that a self-made newspaper magnate could command the same cultural resources as old money dynasties. The hilltop above San Simeon Bay would become not just a home, but a three-dimensional argument about power, taste, and the American capacity to absorb and recontextualize the past. By Christmas Eve 1925, Casa Grande was far enough along for the Hearst family to hold a formal christening of the main house. Guests walked through interiors that were, quite literally, assembled from other centuries. The assembly room, the principal gathering space on the ground floor, featured a monumental Burgundian stone mantel, known as the Great Barney Mantel after the French dealer who sourced it, brought from a French chateau and installed as its focal point. The mantel was massive, carved from limestone, its surface ornamented with heraldic devices and foliate scrolls. Above it, an Italian Renaissance ceiling from a palazzo in Europe spanned the room, each gilded coffer a reminder that these surfaces once sheltered other lives. The ceiling, dating likely from the 16th century, had been disassembled, crated, shipped, and reinstalled, its painted panels and carved ribs carefully mapped and numbered for reassembly. The assembly room's walls were clad in choir stalls from a Spanish monastery, their dark carved wood forming a continuous wainscot punctuated by misericords and Gothic tracery. Flemish and French tapestries hung on the upper walls, depicting hunting scenes and allegorical figures, their colors still vibrant despite centuries of age. The floor was polished stone, interrupted by Persian rugs. Electric lighting, disguised in wrought iron candelabra and wall sconces, illuminated the space at night, creating pools of warm light that softened the hard edges of stone and wood. A concealed elevator tucked into the paneling near the fireplace allowed Hearst to enter the room unannounced from his private quarters above, a theatrical touch that underscored his control over the social choreography of the house. The refectory, completed around 1926 and 1927, offered an even more explicit collage. This long dining hall, stretching more than 70 feet, was designed to evoke a medieval monastery or baronial hall. Choir stalls from the Cathedral of La Seu d'Urgell in Catalonia lined the walls, their carved seats and backs forming a continuous screen of dark wood. Above them hung silk palio banners from Siena, the colorful emblems of the city's medieval contrade, each banner a relic of centuries-old civic rivalries. The ceiling was an Italian Renaissance work purchased in Rome when a Moorish alternative originally sought by Hearst could not be found. Its carved wooden coffers and painted panels created a canopy of geometric ornament overhead. The dining tables, sourced from an Italian monastery, could seat 22 guests. They were long, heavy, and unadorned, their surfaces worn smooth by centuries of use. At one end sat a massive silver wine cooler by David Willaume, the 18th-century English silversmith, weighing over 14 kilograms, a symbol of European aristocracy now pressed into service for a newspaperman's weekend parties. Oversized Gothic chandeliers, their iron frames holding dozens of electric bulbs disguised as candles, threw pools of gold light onto the stone floor. The effect was at once majestic and uncanny, a room assembled from fragments, each authentic in itself, but collectively creating an environment that had never existed in history. On the second floor, the main library began to take shape by the late 1920s. Its 16th-century Spanish ceiling, cobbled from ceilings of 3 different rooms in a single house, was reconfigured by Morgan into a single cohesive plane. The wooden panels, painted with heraldic devices and geometric patterns, were supported on steel trusses hidden above the visible surface. Below, custom-built bookshelves held thousands of volumes, first editions, rare manuscripts, illustrated folios, and rows of ancient Greek vases, some mounted on brackets, others displayed in glass cases, a few wired discreetly to guard against earthquakes. At its peak, Hearst's collection may have numbered over 400 Greek vases, making the room both a reading space and an archaeological gallery. The vases ranged from archaic black figure amphorae to classical red figure kylixes, each a fragment of ancient Mediterranean life now arranged on California shelves. Above the assembly room, the Gothic study, completed in the mid-1920s and further embellished in 1934 and 1935, became Hearst's private editorial cockpit. The room was relatively small, perhaps 30 feet square, but its ceiling was extraordinary, a 14th-century painted woodwork from the House of Jews in Teruel, Spain. The ceiling depicted saints, prophets, and heraldic devices in rich reds, blues, and golds, its panels arranged in a complex geometric pattern. Morgan raised the roof to accommodate this ceiling, installing concrete trusses so that the medieval panels could float over a volume tall enough to impress their new owner. In one letter, when Morgan proposed raising the roof, Hearst telegraphed back his concern about cost. It would be expensive, but he approved it anyway. The room's walls were lined with more carved woodwork, its leaded glass windows offering views toward the mountains. At night, as copies of the San Francisco Examiner and other Hearst papers arrived by wire service, he sat beneath painted prophets and saints, editing headlines that would shape public opinion the next morning. Each of these rooms, the refectory, the assembly room, the library, the Gothic study, was an act of cultural alchemy. Pieces of Europe were lifted from their original contexts, shipped through New York warehouses, and reassembled on an isolated California hill. In an auction catalog from the late 1930s, when financial pressures would force sales, appraisers would describe Hearst's holdings as the most extensive group of art objects and rare furnishings ever brought together by an individual, a phrase meant to impress bidders, but which also hinted at the scale of extraction. Morgan's role in this process was architectural. She took fragments and made them into rooms, reconciling disparate scales, materials, and provenances into spaces that felt, if not historically accurate, at least aesthetically coherent. Architecture here was not just shelter, it was a biography written in stone and wood, combining childhood memories of Camp Hill, European tours with his mother, and industrial profits from yellow journalism and sensational headlines. But each ceiling's prior life hinted at a disquieting truth. If whole rooms could be uprooted and sold, perhaps no context and no fortune was truly permanent. As the last guests left the Christmas Eve celebration in 1925, a crate in a New York warehouse was being packed with yet another ancient ceiling, destined for San Simeon, and another line quietly added to a growing ledger of debt. By the late 1920s, San Simeon was no longer a ranch house with guest cottages. It had become a functioning private city. Architectural statistics, though dry on paper, conveyed the scale of ambition. Approximately 165 rooms spread across Casa Grande and the 3 guest houses, 127 acres of terraced gardens, pools, and walkways encircling the hilltop, and an estate that, at its maximum extent, covered more than 250,000 acres of coastal California. To maintain this city required a small army of staff, Gardeners, cooks, maids, electricians, plumbers, carpenters, animal keepers, chauffeurs, secretaries, and security personnel. At peak occupancy, when Hearst was in residence and hosting large weekend parties, the staff could number in the hundreds. Infrastructure knit this city together. A private airfield down on the ranch received Hearst's Fokker plane and other aircraft bringing preferred guests directly from Los Angeles. The flight took less than 2 hours, a fraction of the time required by train and automobile. The San Simeon Pier, with rail tracks running its length, saw Pacific steamers docking several times a week, unloading cement, steel, tile, furniture, food, wine, and crates of art. The narrow-gauge railway that climbed from the pier to the hilltop ran almost daily during the peak construction years, its cars rattling upward loaded with supplies. Along the ridge, staff housing clustered into an informal village. Bunkhouses for single workers, cottages for families, a commissary, a warehouse, a carpentry shop, and a garage for the fleet of vehicles used to transport guests and supplies. Among the most striking new features was the zoo. By the early 1930s, the Hearst Garden of Comparative Zoology was reportedly the largest private zoo in the world. Enclosures for bears, big cats, antelope, and primates dotted the hillsides, while free-roaming herds of zebra, elk, bison, and other exotics were visible from the winding ranch road. The zoo was not conceived as a conventional caged facility, but as something closer to a safari experience, animals living in large enclosures and open range that blurred the line between spectacle and landscape. Plans drawn up by Morgan showed ambitious designs for elephant houses and specialized habitats, though some of these were never completed. Even so, the operational zoo demanded enormous resources, tons of feed shipped in, specialized staff with veterinary training, fencing and transport infrastructure, and constant vigilance against escapes and injuries. The pergola, a mile-long concrete colonnade draped in wisteria and fruit trees, was built to a height that accommodated, as Morgan joked in a letter, a tall man with a tall hat on a tall horse, allowing Hearst to ride ceremonially along its shaded length. The pergola connected different areas of the estate, providing both shelter from the sun and a formal axial spine for the garden design. Planted beds on either side held roses, fruit trees, and ornamental shrubs, watered by the gravity-fed irrigation system. At night, electric lights strung along the pergola created a glowing path visible from Casa Grande's upper windows. The Neptune pool, meanwhile, was rebuilt again between 1926 and 1928, expanded to accommodate sculptures by French artist Charles Cassou, and extended terraces with marble balustrades. The pool would be altered once more in 1934, when the facade of an ancient Roman temple, dismantled in Europe and shipped in crates, was re-erected above its eastern edge. The temple, dating from the 1st or 2nd century CE, had been purchased through European dealers and reassembled stone by stone, its Corinthian columns and carved entablature framing the pool like a classical stage set. Now measuring more than 104 feet in length, with thousands of square feet of patterned Vermont marble tile lining its basin and terraces and holding 345,000 gallons of water heated by oil burners, the Neptune pool epitomized the marriage of classical imagery and modern engineering. The marble figure at its edge, one of Cassou's sculptures installed during the 1920s, gazed across the water toward the temple facade, a permanent guest at this outdoor theater. At twilight, floodlights illuminated Casa Grande's twin bell towers for guests arriving by car on the coastal highway. One observer later recalled that Hearst would have floodlights turned on his castle so that the arriving pilgrims could spy the twin towers from miles away, a theatrical reveal that turned architecture into a cinematic shot. Below those towers, the marble figure at the edge of the Neptune pool glowed against the darkening hills. It was decorative, almost frivolous, and each hour it stood there added more fuel burned, more pumps running, more staff labor logged. The gardens surrounding the pools and terraces were equally elaborate. Morgan worked with landscape architect Isabella Warren to design planting beds, paths, and ornamental features. Exotic plants, palms, agaves, citrus trees, were imported and adapted to the coastal microclimate. Stone fountains, classical urns, and sculpture niches punctuated the garden walks. Every element was maintained to perfection: lawns mowed, hedges trimmed, flowers dead-headed, paths swept. The illusion was of effortless abundance, but behind it lay constant labor. Inside Casa Grande, technological systems supported the appearance of historical authenticity. Central heating, rare in the 1920s, kept the vast rooms comfortable even on foggy evenings. An internal telephone system connected different wings and guest houses. An elevator, hidden in the assembly room paneling, allowed Hearst to move between floors without using the grand staircase. The kitchen, located in the basement, was equipped with commercial-grade appliances, walk-in refrigerators, multiple ovens, and a full-time pastry kitchen. Food was delivered to dining areas via dumbwaiters and service corridors invisible to guests. The theater, completed in the mid-1920s, seated about 50 people in plush chairs arranged in tiers. Its walls were draped in red damask, gilded caryatids supported the proscenium arch. Hearst's film companies, he had interests in both production and distribution, provided a steady stream of new releases, often screened before their public premieres. Hollywood stars mingled with political figures and newspaper editors in the semi-darkness, watching images flicker across the screen while outside, the Pacific fog rolled over the hills. By 1929, the Enchanted Hill was an organism that consumed money, labor, and material at a scale matched by very few private residences on Earth. To Hearst and his circle, this was proof of success. The estate demonstrated that American industry could not only match European aristocracy, but surpass it, building in a generation what had taken old-world dynasties centuries to accumulate. To the Ledgers, however, it was exposure. The same supply chain that fed the castle's marvels also hardwired it to the vulnerabilities of a volatile economy. Every exotic animal, every imported ceiling, every gallon of heated pool water, every staff paycheck was a line item in a budget that depended on the continued profitability of Hearst's media empire. In October 1929, as stock prices in New York began to plunge, shipments of art and stone were still arriving at San Simon's Pier, and no one on the hilltop yet knew that the architecture of abundance had already crossed its peak. In the early 1920s and 1930s, William Randolph Hearst was not merely wealthy. He was one of the most powerful media figures on Earth. His newspaper chain included the New York Journal, the San Francisco Examiner, the Chicago Examiner, and more than 24 other daily papers. His magazines, Harper's Bazaar, Cosmopolitan, Good Housekeeping, shaped fashion and public opinion for middle-class women. His newsreels, shown in movie theaters before feature films, brought carefully edited visions of current events to millions. Through these outlets, Hearst could amplify political movements, destroy reputations, and set the national agenda on issues from foreign policy to celebrity scandal. The castle at San Simeon became the physical emblem of that influence, a three-dimensional headline written in stone on the California coast. Guests arriving on Friday nights stepped from private rail cars or planes into an orchestrated vision. The route up the hill was lined with glimpses of zoo enclosures and long views out to the Pacific. At the top, staff ushered them into the assembly room, where tapestries and carved stone crowded the walls. Formal introductions were made, cocktails were served from silver trays, conversation flowed in the architectural language of wealth and cultivation. In the evenings, Hearst led them into the theater, whose red damask curtains and gilded caryatids framed screenings from his own film companies. After the films, guests returned to the refectory for late suppers, seated according to carefully calibrated social hierarchies: stars near Hearst and Marion Davies, newcomers and lesser lights farther down the table. The guest lists read like a social index of the era: Charlie Chaplin, Greta Garbo, Cary Grant, the Marx Brothers, Mary Pickford, Jean Harlow, Clark Gable, along with political figures like Winston Churchill, who visited in the 1920s, businessmen, and athletes. Architecturally, their presence was most visible in how spaces were used. The 50-foot dining table in the refectory became a stage for seating arrangements that signaled favor or disfavor. The ornate Gothic study turned into a late-night newsroom where Hearst reviewed proofs, while Hollywood stars waited downstairs for him to rejoin the party. A society columnist described San Simeon as a palace worthy of emperors. a phrase that revealed both admiration and unease at the scale of private power. In 1926, Hearst's personal life shifted. That year, his wife Millicent effectively decamped to New York after the main house's Christmas christening, choosing to remain in the East with their 5 sons while Hearst stayed in California. The Hilltop house became the principal home of Hearst and actress Marion Davies, with whom he had begun a relationship in the late 1910s. Davies was a silent film star whose career Hearst promoted through his media empire, often casting her in expensive productions distributed by his studios. Their partnership further blurred the boundary between media, cinema, and architecture. San Simeon was, simultaneously, residence, studio annex, and publicity machine. Photographs of the castle appeared in fan magazines, reinforcing Hearst's image as a cultural tastemaker and Davies' status as a Hollywood queen. Each of these social rituals had a cost: staff wages, food and wine deliveries, constant maintenance on European antiques, fuel for heating the pools and powering the floodlights. But they also produced intangible value. As long as Hearst's papers were profitable, the castle's role as a symbol of success justified its expense. The cause and effect logic ran both ways. The more the estate projected prestige, the more it reinforced Hearst's aura as an unbeatable tycoon. An aura that made creditors comfortable extending more credit, banks willing to lend against his properties, and dealers eager to offer him first refusal on newly available art. The social code at San Simeon was famously idiosyncratic. Guests were expected to gather for communal meals, but were otherwise free to explore the estate, ride horses, swim in the pools, or wander the gardens. Hearst himself often disappeared into the Gothic study for hours, emerging only for meals or screenings. Alcohol flowed freely despite prohibition, a defiance made possible by Hearst's wealth and political connections. One guest recalled that, "You felt like you were in a dream, a very expensive dream where everything was beautiful and nothing was quite real." But for Marion Davies and the inner circle, life on the hilltop was more complicated. Davies functioned as hostess, mediator, and companion, navigating the social dynamics of a household that was never quite private and never quite public. She oversaw guest lists, smoothed conflicts, and managed the staff with a combination of charm and firmness. Her presence was essential to the castle's social success, yet her ambiguous status, neither wife nor mere guest, created tensions that occasionally surfaced in whispered gossip or awkward silences. By 1930, the castle had become a fixture in the American cultural imagination. Newspapers ran features on its construction. Architectural journals published photographs of its interiors. Tourists on the coastal highway craned their necks to glimpse the hilltop towers. Hearst was pleased by the attention, which reinforced his image as a self-made Renaissance prince. But the attention also brought scrutiny. Critics began to ask uncomfortable questions about the sources of such wealth, the ethics of transplanting European cultural heritage to an isolated California ranch, and the labor conditions of the workers who maintained the estate. Late one evening in 1930, after a screening, the guests drifted out along the terrace. The marble figure at the edge of the Neptune pool reflected in water disturbed by a few stray ripples from a late swim. Laughter echoed softly across the hills, mingling with the distant sound of the surf. At this moment, the castle appeared invulnerable, a monument to the idea that money and will could overcome any obstacle, even time itself. In less than a decade, auction catalogs would reduce this same scene to itemized lots, and the man who orchestrated it would be paying rent to live in his own house. By the mid-1920s, the hilltop's most startling feature for first-time guests was not a room, but the animals. As cars climbed the winding road from the coast, herds of zebra, antelope, and other exotics grazed in pastures fenced with wire nearly invisible against the grassland. Closer to the summit, cages and pits along Orchard Hill held bears, big cats, and primates. This was the Hearst Garden of comparative zoology, conceived not as a conventional city zoo with small enclosures and crowds of visitors, but as something closer to a safari experience. Animals living in large, naturalistic habitats that blurred the line between spectacle and landscape. Plans drawn up by Morgan showed ambitious designs for specialized facilities. an elephant house with reinforced floors and high ceilings, aviaries for tropical birds, heated shelters for primates. Some of these were built, others remained on paper as costs mounted or Hearst's priorities shifted. Even so, the operational zoo was enormous. At its peak, it housed lions, bears, leopards, pumas, monkeys, chimpanzees, exotic birds, and an array of ungulates from Africa and Asia. Free-roaming herds included zebras, emus, llamas, and at various times giraffes and kangaroos. A visitor in a later account noted that Hearst Castle was once home to the world's largest private zoo, a superlative that added to its mythology while hinting at continuing expense. Maintaining the zoo required a dedicated staff, animal keepers who fed and cleaned enclosures, a veterinarian or someone with veterinary training on call, laborers to repair fencing and shelters, and drivers to transport feed and bedding materials from the pier. Food came in by the ton: hay, grain, meat for carnivores, fruits and vegetables for primates. Some animals required specialized diets or medical care. Escapes, though rare, demanded immediate response. One story, possibly apocryphal, described a bear wandering into the gardens near Casa Grande, prompting a frantic effort to recapture it before guests noticed. The zoo, like the Neptune pool, turned nature into a curated experience. Children of guests delighted in feeding deer or watching lions pace behind bars. Adults discussed politics and film careers while zebras grazed in the background, their striped forms moving through golden grass like figures in a dream. W.C. Fields reportedly quipped that the estate was a wonderful place to bring up children. You can send them out to play and they won't come back till they're grown, a joke about the ranch's sheer size that doubled as a commentary on its surreal isolation. This garden of animals was part of the same supply chain that delivered antique ceilings. Ships brought in not only stone and tapestries, but also crates of live animals that had to be fed and housed for years. In economic terms, every exotic creature was a long-term liability, a drain on cash flow that continued whether or not Hearst was in residence, whether or not revenues from his newspapers were strong. In symbolic terms, they extended his desire to possess not just objects from other cultures and epochs, but living embodiments of distant places. The zebras grazing on California hills were no less transplanted than the Spanish ceilings overhead. By the early 1930s, as the Depression deepened, staff began to worry about the zoo's sustainability. Balancing books for feed and care became more difficult as ad revenues softened across Hearst's media empire. Morgan's letters from this period occasionally mention the zoo in passing, noting requests for repairs to enclosures or concerns about drainage in animal areas. But the larger question, whether the zoo could continue indefinitely, was left unspoken. Architecture here was not just buildings. It was the human and animal system needed to make them feel full. The same ambition that filled the refectory with European woodwork filled the hills with African and Asian fauna, and each mouth tied the estate more tightly to a cash flow that would soon contract. Behind the theatrical scenes on the hilltop ran an unseen logistics operation. In the 1920s, crates of art objects and architectural fragments arrived first at a 5-story warehouse in New York, where dealers cataloged European purchases before forwarding them to California. The most important of these agents was Arthur Bine, an Iberian specialist based in Spain who located dozens of Spanish ceilings, doors, and stone elements for Hearst. Bine's correspondence with Morgan, preserved in archives, reveals both the complexity of the art market and the ethical ambiguities of cultural extraction. He described buildings being demolished, convents selling their possessions to pay debts, and private collections coming onto the market as European aristocratic families faced financial pressures after World War I. Hearst was not the only American buyer, but he was among the most aggressive, willing to outbid competitors for pieces that struck his fancy. By 1930, Hearst's collection numbered approximately 25,000 artifacts at San Simeon alone, ranging from ancient Egyptian statues of Sekhmet placed on the South Esplanade to Roman sarcophagi in guesthouse courtyards and Greek vases in the library. Each item required not only purchase, but shipping, insurance, customs clearing, and installation into Morgan's evolving plans. Some pieces arrived damaged, others proved incompatible with the spaces Morgan had designed, requiring improvisation. Storage was a constant problem. Warehouses at the pier and on the hilltop overflowed with crates, awaiting installation, many of which would never be unpacked. The building materials followed similar paths. Sand was initially dredged from San Simeon Bay, then later trucked from Carmel when the local supply proved inadequate. This sand was mixed with stone, quarried from the hill itself to create a high-quality concrete that Morgan specified for structural and decorative work. Steel framing came by rail from mills in the east, roof tiles from California and European suppliers, plumbing fixtures from manufacturers in New York and Chicago, electrical equipment from a variety of sources. During the Great Depression, when construction slowed or stopped elsewhere in California, San Simeon continued to employ hundreds of local workers, providing a lifeline to San Luis Obispo County even as it deepened the owner's financial exposure. One key document in this chapter is a 1920 letter from Hearst to Morgan. "All little houses are stunning. Please complete before I can think of any more changes." It was a charming line, self-deprecating and affectionate, but also revealing. Hearst's constant revisions, enlarging the Neptune pool, reconfiguring Casa Grande's wings, adding and re-adding rooms, changing ceiling heights to accommodate newly acquired art, ensured that the construction site never fully paused. Each change order rippled back through the supply chain, new drawings, new shipments, new labor budgets, new invoices. Morgan managed these changes with remarkable patience, but even she occasionally expressed frustration in letters to her office staff, noting the difficulty of maintaining construction schedules when plans could shift on a telegram's notice. By the late 1920s, estimates suggest that, in today's dollars, the project's total cost would approach the equivalent of hundreds of millions. One modern analysis by the Smithsonian Institution pegged it near $700 million when adjusted for inflation, though exact figures are elusive because spending was spread across decades, multiple entities, and a bewildering array of purchases. What is clear is the direction. Hearst's built dream was drawing on a fortune that even his vast media empire could only barely sustain. Each year, revenues from newspapers and magazines had to cover not only operating costs, but also the ongoing construction, the zoo, the staff payroll, the art purchases, and the routine maintenance of what had already been built. In a visual sequence, the camera might track a crate labeled San Simeon from a European port, perhaps Marseille or Barcelona, across the Atlantic by steamer through customs in New York, onto a transcontinental rail line, then onto a coastwise steamer at San Pedro, up the California coast to San Simeon Bay, and finally onto the narrow-gauge car climbing to the hill. It is a single object's journey, perhaps the marble figure destined for the Neptune pool's edge, but multiplied by tens of thousands. Supply chains usually remain invisible, but at San Simeon, they were the true architecture behind the architecture. The castle was not just concrete and stone, it was an arrangement of credit, shipping timetables, dealer relationships, and wage rolls. When any of those systems faltered, the marble statue at the pool's edge became not just an ornament, but a ledger entry. In 1929, the financial system that underwrote this constant motion would convulse, and the very pipelines that fed San Simeon's grandeur would begin to choke. The stock market crash of October 1929 did not immediately silence San Simeon. Construction continued into the early 1930s, even as advertising revenues at Hearst newspapers began to shrink. American businesses, facing collapsing consumer demand, cut their marketing budgets, classified ads dried up, circulation declined as unemployed readers could no longer afford subscriptions. Hearst's empire, built on the optimism of the 1920s, faced a sudden contraction. To cover operating costs and maintain his lifestyle, Hearst began issuing bonds backed by his properties and leaning harder on credit lines from banks, effectively mortgaging not only his real estate, but also future profits that might never materialize. By 1933, he had mortgaged the San Simeon estate itself to Harry Chandler, the rival publisher of the Los Angeles Times, for $600,000, a sum that sounds modest by today's standards, but which represented a significant lien against the property. The arrangement remained mostly invisible to the guests who still sipped cocktails by the Neptune pool and watched films in the theater. Chandler, a shrewd businessman, was betting that Hearst would recover. The mortgage was a business transaction, not an act of friendship, though the two men maintained cordial relations in public. Behind the scenes, financial reports grew more alarming. A combination of Depression-era losses, continued construction at San Simeon and other Hearst properties, lavish spending on art and personal expenses, and ill-advised investments in motion pictures left Hearst with debts that varied by account. A PBS documentary later placed the total at more than $95 million by 1937. Other sources suggested figures as high as $126 million. The precise number matters less than the trajectory. An estate meant to symbolize invincibility was now anchored to a man on the verge of insolvency. His annual income, while still substantial, could not cover the debt service, operating expenses, and new purchases he continued to make. In 1937, under heavy pressure from banks and bondholders who threatened foreclosure, trustees were appointed to take control of the Hearst Corporation's finances. The trustees, lawyers and accountants acting on behalf of creditors, had broad powers to restructure the business, sell assets, and impose budgets. One of their directives was blunt: construction at San Simeon must stop. A widely cited remark from that year has Hearst telling Julia Morgan to stop work entirely at San Simeon, ending nearly 2 decades of near-continuous building. Morgan, then in her mid-60s, accepted the decision with her characteristic stoicism, though she must have felt the abrupt halt as a professional disappointment. On the hilltop, the impact was immediate. Scaffolding sat idle on partially finished sections of Casa Grande's north wing. Stacks of tile and stone in Morgan's Bayside warehouses gathered dust, awaiting a resumption that might never come. Workers were laid off. The construction village emptied. The sounds of sawing and hammering faded, replaced by wind and the occasional bleat of livestock. The Neptune pool, still structurally sound and maintained by a reduced staff, became a symbol of arrested motion. The marble figure on its edge now looked out over water that, while still heated and circulated, was no longer a stage for new construction, only for the preservation of what already existed. Hearst's personal response mixed fury and heartbreak. He had spent nearly 2 decades pouring money and imagination into the hilltop, creating something he believed would outlast him. Now, as appraisers began inventorying his art, not to admire it, but to prepare it for sale, he complained bitterly in letters that dealers greatly cheapened them and us, and advertised his treasures like a bargain basement sale. The man who once bought whole ceilings in ancient temples now saw them reduced to lot numbers in catalogs, their cultural significance erased by the need to generate cash. The Depression had exposed a fundamental weakness in Hearst's financial structure. His wealth was tied up in illiquid assets, newspapers, real estate, art collections that could not be quickly converted to cash without significant losses. Selling art at auction during a depression meant accepting prices far below what he had paid. Selling newspapers meant ceding influence and income streams. The trustees' strategy was to liquidate enough to satisfy creditors while preserving the core of the media business, a delicate balancing act that required Hearst to accept humiliations he had never imagined. Cracks in concrete could be repaired, but cracks in credit were less forgiving. San Simeon's story showed how architecture, once built, became both asset and liability, something that could be mortgaged, inventoried, and theoretically sold, but not easily liquidated piece by piece without erasing the very meaning it was built to project. A castle without its context was just stone and wood. A collection scattered across auction houses lost the narrative coherence that had made it impressive. As trustees combed through warehouses and galleries, they discovered that the most extensive group of art objects ever brought together by an individual could indeed be turned into cash, but only at a painful loss that would haunt its collector for the rest of his life. Between 1937 and 1939, San Simeon entered a strange limbo. The castle still stood. Casa Grande's rooms still held their imported ceilings and tapestries. Some guests still came, though fewer and with less fanfare. But elsewhere, in New York and other cities, Auctioneers began offering the contents of Hearst's warehouses and city residences to the public. At Park Bernay Galleries and at Gimbel's department store, which mounted a notorious sale of Hearst material, library collections went under the hammer. First editions by Charles Dickens, Hearst's favorite author, rare manuscripts, illuminated medieval books, and entire groups of furniture, tapestries, and decorative objects. The sales were advertised widely, sometimes to Hearst's embarrassment, as opportunities to acquire pieces from the Hearst collection, a phrase that turned his private passion into a public liquidation. Appraisers fanned out through the estate, cataloging everything from ancient Greek vases to modern silver services. A descriptive brochure from one sale boasted of the most extensive group of art objects and rare furnishings ever brought together by an individual, hoping to turn superlatives into sales. The brochure listed hundreds of items: Renaissance paintings, Gothic sculptures, Persian rugs, Chinese porcelains, each described in language meant to evoke rarity and investment value. But in private, dealers knew the market was weak. Depressed economic conditions meant many items sold for far less than Hearst had paid. One account noted that, overall, he lost hundreds of thousands of dollars on these transactions, a financial blow that compounded the humiliation of seeing his life's collecting dispersed. Legally, Hearst avoided formal bankruptcy, a point his biographers stress. He was never declared insolvent by a court. His debts were restructured rather than discharged. But in lived experience, the process felt indistinguishable from bankruptcy. Appraisers opened cabinets in the Gothic study, noting paintings and objects. They walked through the refectory and assembly room, photographing tapestries for catalogs. They itemized library collections and counted vases. Their presence changed the atmosphere of the hilltop. Rooms once curated to impress guests now looked like assets waiting to be liquidated, their beauty reduced to insurance appraisals and lot descriptions. One particular irony emerged in 1939, when Time magazine published a feature revealing that Hearst was at risk of defaulting on the mortgage to Harry Chandler and might lose San Simeon altogether, a public humiliation for a man who had made and unmade reputations in print. The article detailed his financial struggles with a mix of schadenfreude and fascination, portraying him as a cautionary tale of overreach. Chandler ultimately agreed to extend the loan, a gesture later described as good-naturedly agreeing not to foreclose, but the episode underscored how precarious Hearst's control had become. He was living in his own house on borrowed time, dependent on the goodwill of a business rival. During this period, the hilltop's most poignant image was not a demolished room, but one that remained intact. The Roman pool, completed around 1934 and 1935, and tiled in blue and gold Murano glass mosaics inspired by the mausoleum of Galla Placidia at Ravenna. The pool, located indoors beneath Casa Grande's north wing, was smaller than the Neptune pool but more jewel-like. Its walls and floor were covered in tiny glass tesserae, each backed with gold or colored foil, creating a shimmering surface that seemed to glow even in dim light. 8 statues of Roman gods and heroes, carved in marble, stood in niches around the perimeter. The ceiling, also tiled, reflected light off the water in rippling patterns. It was one of Morgan's greatest technical achievements, requiring precise calculations of waterproofing, structural support for the tile work, and lighting design. The tiny gold tesserae, each backed with leaves, glinted under the electric lights even when no one swam. Their shimmering surface became the visual counterpart to the ledgers in New York, a field of small individual units whose combined value was both dazzling and, in crisis, terribly vulnerable. If the pool were ever dismantled, the tesserae could be counted and weighed, but their beauty would vanish, replaced by an inventory of materials. Inventory was a form of biography. When appraisers listed Hearst's possessions, they were also listing the choices of a lifetime: every ceiling bought, every statue installed, every tile laid. Architecture, once so solid, became words on thin paper. In that transformation, the enchanted hill began to disappear, not physically, but financially. The dream was now an itemized list. In the late 1930s, the financial crisis forced painful decisions on the ground. Household staff were reduced, some longtime employees were let go, others took pay cuts. Gardeners, once numerous enough to maintain every inch of the 127-acre hilltop, now focused on the areas most visible to guests, allowing more remote terraces to grow weedy. The zoo, expensive to maintain, was slowly dismantled. Exotic animals were sold or donated, many to the Los Angeles Zoo and other institutions that could provide proper care. The process was gradual and, in some cases, heartbreaking. Animals that had lived on the hilltop for years were crated and trucked away, leaving empty enclosures that gradually fell into disrepair. Visitors decades later would still see zebra descendants grazing the ranch pastures visible from Highway 1, ghostly remnants of the once vast menagerie, but most enclosures fell quiet. Hearst's friend and construction supervisor George Lures captured the mood in a rueful comment preserved in correspondence. Hearst would like to start work on the outside pool, start a new reservoir, etc., but told me yesterday, "I want so many things but haven't got the money." Poor fellow, let's take up a collection. The outside pool Lures mentioned was almost certainly the Neptune pool, already completed in its final form, but still requiring maintenance, fuel for heating, and staff to clean and operate it. For the first time, the marble figure at its edge stood vigil over a landscape where ambitions were no longer automatically funded. Then, in December 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor shifted the castle's story onto a global axis. The United States entered World War II, and suddenly, the isolated California coast seemed vulnerable. Fearing Japanese naval attacks or even invasion, Hearst and Marion Davies closed San Simeon and relocated to Wintoon, another Hearst estate in the mountains of Northern California, thought to be less exposed. Tours, which had occasionally been offered to select groups, ceased. The hilltop was largely shuttered to outsiders. Wartime resource constraints, rationing of gasoline, restrictions on coastal travel, shortages of building materials, further curtailed maintenance. Staff were reduced to a skeleton crew tasked with basic upkeep, preventing leaks, protecting furnishings, and ensuring that animals remaining on the ranch were fed. The Roman pool, with its 8 statues of Roman gods and heroes, became an almost private space for a declining household. The gold tesserae were still there, still glinting in the rare moments when lights were turned on, but the echoes, the sounds of parties and laughter, of swimmers and splashing, were gone. In preservation reports decades later, conservators would note how little some areas were used during the war, a paradoxical boon for their physical condition, but a sign of the estate's functional dormancy. Dust accumulated on surfaces. Some plumbing systems, left unused, developed problems. Animals in the zoo died or were relocated, leaving the hills eerily quiet. By the early 1940s, Hearst was living under the constraints of the trusteeship imposed in 1937. His personal salary was capped, dividends from his companies were withheld to pay down debt. He had to, famously, pay rent to continue living in his own San Simeon house, a symbolic and financial humiliation that underscored how completely his financial autonomy had been compromised. For a man who once purchased entire cloisters on a whim, this dependence on approval from trustees and accountants was a profound reversal. He chafed under the restrictions, but had little choice. The alternative was formal bankruptcy and the complete loss of his media empire. Silence became the estate's dominant sound. Where architecture once amplified activity, the clatter of dishes in the kitchen, music from the theater, laughter on the terraces, it now amplified absence. Empty cages, idle kitchens, an unused theater whose red curtains hung motionless. In that stillness, the moral ambiguity of the hilltop became sharper. The same structures that had provided employment to hundreds of workers and created a unique cultural display, a place where ancient art and modern California met, now symbolized concentrated wealth whose costs had spilled far beyond one man's comfort. When the war ended and prosperity returned, Hearst would briefly reclaim some control and even resume limited building. But the enchanted hill he returned to in 1945 was already a relic of a world that no longer existed. In 1945, with wartime restrictions easing and the American economy transitioning to peacetime production, Hearst and Marion Davies returned to San Simeon. The hilltop, after years of minimal maintenance, showed signs of neglect. Paint peeling in places, gardens overgrown, mechanical systems in need of repair. Hearst, now 82 years old, was determined to complete some of the unfinished work. Construction resumed on a smaller scale. Julia Morgan, aging and increasingly delegating to assistants like Warren McClure, oversaw completion of bathrooms and service areas in Casa Grande's unfinished north wing. The work was careful but constrained. The era of large expansions, of reimagining the Neptune pool or adding entire new guest houses, was over. This was finishing work, the kind of detail-oriented craftsmanship that tied up loose ends rather than opening new vistas. Morgan, by now in her early 70s, had maintained her office in San Francisco throughout the war, though her workload had diminished. Her relationship with Hearst, always professional but warm, continued through correspondence and occasional visits. She understood that San Simeon represented the culmination of her career. No other project had lasted as long or demanded as much creativity and technical skill. But she also understood that the client who had once approved every change without hesitation now lived within strict financial limits. Drawings from this period show modest improvements, updated plumbing fixtures, rewiring for electrical systems, repairs to tile and plaster. These were necessary tasks, but they lacked the excitement of earlier years when the project seemed to expand endlessly. Hearst's health declined steadily through the mid-1940s. He suffered from heart problems and other ailments typical of advanced age. Doctors advised that he relocate closer to advanced medical care in Los Angeles, where hospitals and specialists were readily available. On May 2, 1947, he left San Simeon for the last time, moving to Marion Davies's house in Beverly Hills, a comfortable estate, but far removed from the grandeur of the hilltop. Staff watched as cars wound down the hill. There was no dramatic ceremony, no farewell speech, just an aging man leaving a house he had assumed he would never have to abandon. Some staff reportedly wept. Others simply returned to their duties, uncertain of what the future held for the estate. In the Gothic study, the 14th-century ceiling from Teruel remained in place, its painted panels still vibrant after decades. The desk still held the residue of his editorial work, pens, notepads, stacks of newspapers. In the Roman pool, dust gathered on the gold tesserae, dimming their glow. At the Neptune pool, the marble figure stood as it always had, gazing across water toward the Roman temple facade. But with Hearst gone, the castle's raison d'etre had dissolved. Without its owner and his circle of guests, San Simeon was no longer a living house. It was a paused tableau, its future uncertain. Would the family maintain it? Would it be sold? Would it simply decay like so many grand estates before it? Hearst died on August 14, 1951, in Los Angeles, still under the financial oversight of trustees. His estate was complex. Media properties, real estate holdings, art collections scattered across multiple locations. His sons inherited control of the Hearst Corporation, which by then had been restructured and was on firmer financial footing. Julia Morgan, who had worked with him for nearly 3 decades, died in 1957 at the age of 85. Her architectural legacy was secure. She had designed more than 700 buildings over her career. But San Simeon remained her most famous and controversial work. In 1958, the Hearst family, recognizing both the impracticality of maintaining the estate privately and its potential as a public monument, donated the main hilltop complex and many of its contents to the state of California. The donation included Casa Grande, the 3 guest houses, the pools, the terraces, and approximately 120 acres of gardens and immediate grounds. The surrounding ranch land remained in family hands. The house reopened that June as Hearst San Simeon State Historical Monument, a California state park managed in partnership with the Hearst Corporation. Visitors could now tour the rooms that had once been private, walk the terraces where Hollywood stars had mingled, and swim, in later years, at least briefly, in the pools that had symbolized unattainable luxury. The disappearance in this act was not architectural, but existential. The walls remained. The view was unchanged. The marble figure at the Neptune pool kept its pose. What had vanished was the singular combination of capital, personality, and historical moment that had animated the enchanted hill. The castle was now a museum, its meanings fixed by tour guides and brochures rather than by the whims of its creator. The marble figure, once a decoration for a living household, was now an artifact in a public monument, an unintentional memorial to a man who tried to outbuild the limits of a single lifetime. When the first tour groups climbed the hill in 1958, they stepped into rooms preserved almost as Hearst left them. But their tickets were priced not as offerings to power, but as contributions to a public institution that asked a quieter question. What do we inherit when we inherit excess? When Hearst Castle opened to the public in June 1958, visitors encountered a place already layered with interpretations. State park brochures emphasized art and architecture, 25,000 artifacts from around the world, from ancient Egyptian statues of the goddess Sekhmet on the South Esplanade to Roman sarcophagi in guesthouse courtyards, Renaissance paintings, Greek vases, and Tiffany silver. Guides, some of them former employees or local residents who remembered the estate in its private years, narrated the castle's history in carefully measured tones, part admiration for the architectural achievement, part cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition. The tours followed prescribed routes, showing visitors the assembly room, the refectory, the libraries, bedrooms in the guest houses, and, weather permitting, the outdoor terraces and pools. Over time, restoration and preservation efforts became their own form of architectural labor. The state of California, working with the Hearst Corporation and later with federal preservation agencies, undertook systematic conservation of the buildings and their contents. Reports detail the repair of tiled terraces, original plumbing systems, elevators, wood doors, carved stone, and historic finishes, all in line with National Park Service standards for historic sites. In the Gothic suite, conservators stabilized the 14th-century ceiling panels from Teruel, cleaning centuries of soot and later grime without damaging the painted surfaces. The refectory's silk paleo banners, fragile from age and light exposure, were replaced with copies to protect the originals, which were stored in climate-controlled archives. The Neptune pool, long a symbol of extravagance, acquired new layers of meaning in the 21st century. In 2014, amid California's severe drought and after decades of water loss from leaks in the aging structure, the pool was drained for a comprehensive repair project. Engineers discovered extensive cracking in the concrete basin, deterioration of the tile grout, and problems with the plumbing and heating systems. For several years, visitors peered into a vast, dry basin, its patterned Vermont marble floor exposed to sun and wind, the marble figure standing guard over emptiness. Engineers injected grout to stabilize the structure, replaced corroded pipes, and resealed surfaces with modern waterproofing materials. In 2018, after more than $10 million in repairs, the pool was refilled, an event marked by press coverage and later honored with a Preservation Design Award for Historic Rehabilitation by the California Preservation Foundation. The restored pool, gleaming and watertight, was opened for limited swimming events, allowing contemporary visitors to experience, if briefly, what Hearst's guests had known. Meanwhile, descendant herds of zebras still graze on the surrounding ranch, visible from Highway 1, living echoes of the old zoo now woven into the region's tourism image. Visitors riding buses up the hill heard about the largest private zoo, the airfield, the film screenings, and the near bankruptcy. The narrative evolved over the decades, balancing awe at the artistic achievements of Julia Morgan and her craftspeople with an increasingly frank acknowledgement of the economic and social structures that made the estate possible. Modern interpretive materials discuss Hearst's labor practices, the ethics of cultural extraction, the environmental impact of maintaining exotic animals and expansive gardens in a semi-arid climate, and the role of wealth inequality in shaping the American landscape. Inside the Roman pool, the tiny gold tesserae still reflected light when the underwater lamps were turned on for tours. But where once they framed the bodies of Hollywood guests, they now framed reflections of tourists with audio guides, smartphones held aloft to capture the shimmering beauty. The pool appeared in films, fashion shoots, and architectural documentaries, its image circulating far beyond the Central California coast. On social media, it often appeared simply as a backdrop for images of leisure, a new layer of spectacle detached from the original context of power and personality that had created it. Conservation challenges continued. Earthquakes, including a significant temblor in 2003, required seismic retrofitting of Casa Grande's structure. Concrete, for all its strength, was not invulnerable. It cracked, spalled, and required ongoing maintenance. Tile roofs leaked, wood trim rotted in the coastal fog, mechanical systems needed updating. The state of California allocated millions of dollars for these efforts, a public investment in preserving a monument to private wealth. Some critics questioned the expenditure. Why should taxpayers fund the upkeep of a tycoon's castle? Defenders argued that San Simeon, whatever its origins, had become part of the state's cultural heritage, a unique architectural and artistic achievement that deserved preservation alongside missions, Victorian homes, and other historic landmarks. As a state monument, San Simeon traded exclusivity for accessibility. Tens of thousands of visitors toured the estate each year, far more than Hearst had ever hosted. But in that transformation, it also shifted from a projection of one man's immortality into a shared object of memory. Its preservation budgets, tour scripts, and restoration campaigns were new ways of deciding what this architecture meant and whom it served. The castle no longer embodied the will of a single owner. It embodied collective choices about which past to remember, which stories to tell, which structures to maintain. The castle survived, but in its survival it posed an uncomfortable question. What does it mean when a monument to private power is preserved with public funds long after the debts that almost destroyed it have been quietly absorbed by history? In the present, standing on the terrace of Casa Grande, a visitor looks out over a landscape that is both intact and incomplete. Casa Grande's floor area, around 68,500 square feet, and its 42 bedrooms, 61 bathrooms, 19 sitting rooms, theater, libraries, and pools are all still there. Carefully maintained by state park staff and volunteer docents, the guest houses remain furnished as they were in the 1940s, their rooms frozen in a particular moment of American history. Yet, historians remind us that the house is unfinished. Julia Morgan's master model, photographed and hand-colored in the 1930s and now preserved in archives, shows wings and details that were never realized once the financial crisis of 1937 halted work. The north wing of Casa Grande, for instance, has rooms that were completed only in their basic form, lacking the elaborate finishes Morgan had envisioned. Fragments of the San Simeon project now live elsewhere. Greek vases once wired to library shelves sit in museum cases at institutions across the country. Some ceilings intended for the castle never left warehouses and eventually found other homes. A few were purchased by museums, others by private collectors who installed them in their own residences or donated them to universities. Auction catalogs preserved in archives at the Huntington Library, the Bancroft Library at UC Berkeley, and elsewhere read like biographies in reverse, listing the deconstruction of a life's collecting. The supply chain of excess that built the castle ended in many cases with an equal and opposite chain of dispersal, the carefully assembled fragments returning to the market, their meanings once again detached from the whole. Philosophically, Hearst Castle invites conflicting readings, and it resists easy judgment. It can be admired as a collaboration between an extraordinarily imaginative architect and a client whose willingness to fund experiments produced spaces like the Gothic study with its floating medieval ceiling, the Roman pool with its glowing mosaics, of undeniable beauty. Morgan's technical achievements alone, moving mature oak trees, engineering complex water systems, integrating historical fragments into structurally sound modern buildings, place her among the great architects of the 20th century. The castle showcases her ability to synthesize Beaux-Arts principles with California conditions, creating a distinctive regional architecture that influenced later generations. It can also be critiqued as an emblem of Gilded Age and early 20th century excess, a physical manifestation of the inequalities and extractive practices that underpinned media empires. Hearst's fortune came from newspapers that often engaged in sensationalism, yellow journalism, and manipulation of public opinion. His collecting removed cultural artifacts from their original contexts, participating in a broader pattern of American appropriation of European and ancient heritage. The labor that built and maintained the estate, the carpenters, masons, gardeners, cooks, maids, animal keepers, was essential to its existence, but often invisible in its public image. The estate's very existence depended on a concentration of wealth and power that left little room for those who built it to share in its grandeur. Both readings are true, and the building itself refuses to settle neatly into either. It is simultaneously a masterpiece of design and a monument to ego, a treasury of art and a symbol of extraction, a place of extraordinary beauty and a site of profound inequality. These contradictions coexist in the marble and tile, in the imported ceilings and the California light, in the pools that shimmer on the edge of the continent. As a narrator in a documentary, the voiceover in this final act moves more slowly, allowing pauses for reflection. It notes how marble and concrete weather differently, how the tiled terraces require ongoing regrouting every few decades, how seismic retrofits after the 2/3 earthquake demonstrated both the strength and vulnerability of Morgan's reinforced concrete. It observes that Julia Morgan, once overlooked in architectural histories that privileged male architects, is now celebrated, honored posthumously as the first woman awarded the AIA Gold Medal in 2014, decades after her death. It acknowledges that William Randolph Hearst, once feared as a media baron capable of swaying elections and starting wars, is now often remembered through the lens of Orson Welles' Citizen Kane and This Hilltop House, his power reduced to a cautionary tale. In the closing image, the film returns to where it began. The year is now recent. The camera stands at the edge of the Neptune pool at dusk. The marble figure, unchanged since the 1930s when Charles Cassou's sculptures were installed, still looks across the water to the Roman temple facade. Tourists have gone for the day. The hilltop is quiet except for the sound of wind in the cypress trees and a faint hum from modern pumps maintaining the pool's circulation. For a moment, as the light fades, the pool's surface reflects not people but sky, a moving mirror that outlasts any human plan. The water, heated no longer, cools in the evening air. The marble figure remains patient and indifferent, as it has for nearly a century. The narrator's final reflection is simple. This place was built to make one man's name endure in stone, water, and light. It nearly cost him everything, and it did not grant him immortality. Hearst is remembered, but not as he imagined, not as a Renaissance prince or media emperor, but as a figure of contradictions, of ambition met with limits. Yet in the fragments that remain, a ceiling from Terrell floating above a California study, a mosaic tile from Ravenna glowing in an indoor pool, a marble figure overlooking the Pacific, we glimpse something larger than him, the recurring human wish to resist time and time's quiet insistence on turning every defiance into history. The enchanted hill stands, preserved and interpreted, no longer private but not entirely public, no longer a home but not quite a museum. It is a threshold between eras, a place where Gilded Age excess meets modern preservation, where one man's dream becomes a shared inheritance. The marble figure fades into darkness. The hilltop remains, not as a promise of forever, but as a carefully preserved reminder that even America's most powerful tycoons build, in the end, on borrowed time.